Front, come forward, come forward.
Speak friend, enter.
Join the friendly group, right? This is not like school where you have to sit in the back of the class so the teacher won't notice you. All right, so who's in charge of this panel? You're in charge, right?
I
That's what it said on
the.
the. What it said in the notes. It said
Oh,
you're
did
in
it?
charge. It specifically said that you're in charge.
Oh, awesome.
You can trust me. Don't look, but just trust me on that.
That's a terrible idea.
You don't even know me. Normally it takes people at least a panel to find out they can't trust me.
All right. Well, so since I have now been drafted to run the panel, thank you for coming to Sci-Fi Writing with or without furries, because we're going to probably be general sci-fi and furry aspects. My co-panelists are Maggie Hogarth.
I was pointing to him.
Okay.
Start at the end.
Okay, Rob Baird.
Yep. Hi.
And Maggie Hogarth, and myself. I'm Sear Otter. I write as James Stone. I figured what we can do is we'll give our introductions and see where things go from there. So,
Hey, so yeah, I'm Rob. I write a lot of science fiction. You can find me, like most recently in Dogs of War, I wrote a near future-ish uplifted animals story. I think sci-fi is really cool, and I think furry has a lot of intersection with sci-fi that isn't necessarily always discussed, and there are a lot of, I think, interesting opportunities for us within the space of science fiction. And I think we are in a very interesting stage of that existence. So I am a cartographer in real life. Map making is like modern day science fiction in a lot of ways. And I think there are interesting things where we stand at the cusp of things that we would not necessarily have considered science fiction until, or that we would have considered science fiction until quite recently.
Tell them about the cool cartography thing you said in email. Like what you did.
Oh no.
You did something. It was really neat. I'm like, wow, that's cool and important.
I don't know. I do cartographic things when I'm doing world building, which I think is I build maps and then build maps that can be used in world building. I probably talked about satellite navigation. Satellite navigation is complete science fiction, right? 300 years ago, the King of England, Parliament issued a £3 million prize for anybody who could discover your location to within the closest 30 miles after a bunch of ships ran aground. And nobody ever collected that prize. And nowadays, everybody on their phone has something that can tell their location to within, 4 meters. That is like magic. It's been radically transformative in ways that if you had told people, that commodity devices that you could spend, a 20-cent chip that you could put in anything would tell where something was to within 4 meters, and it would allow bike sharing and just tracking your package and all of these things that have become commodities that we don't really even think about, but were completely incomprehensible 20 years ago, is that technology wasn't there. That's one of those instances where people talk about the intersection of science fiction and reality, things like Star Trek and communicators and things like that, but the way that the world develops around these technologies is, I think, super exciting.
That is cool. Well, I think about those things all the time because I have to explain them to a 10-year-old. Did you know that calling people in other states cost more money once upon a time than it did to call someone who lived next door? What? How do you even know where they are? Like, oh yeah, and area codes used to have a function, and she's like, what's an area code?
It's the first 3 numbers in front of the number.
You're right, but it doesn't really serve a purpose by their standards anymore. But anyway, hi, I'm Maggie. I'm a full-time writer and a full-time mom, and I'm not sure how that works. And I write lots of novels, and they're all on Amazon, Barnes Noble, whatever. So that's why I'm here, because I like science fiction.
I am Sear Otter. I write as James Stone because I didn't want to necessarily get tied to being Sear Otter forever, because
Wow, smart.
personas change sometimes.
Yeah.
In real life, I am a programmer for NASA, which possibly sounds cooler than it is because I still sit in front of a computer and program and occasionally see astronauts.
No, that is cool. That's just categorically cool. You can't get away from it.
I've been a fan of sci-fi for basically forever. I think like the first books I read in sci-fi were.
Can you remember that?
I'm not sure I can remember that. I know I read lots of Tolkien when I was a kid, but
Of course.
that's probably not applicable to
Pern?
the panel. Yeah, Pern. Yeah, and Pern was kind of a weird crossover between sci-fi
True.
and.
True. I think of it as science fiction because it became science fiction later. But,
Oh yeah, that's true.
but that's a good question. Like, I came into furry through science fiction when I was 12 or whatever, because when I was 12, furry fiction was something barely held together by BBSs across the country, and there was no internet to have really cool things like fur affinity. So it was really tiny, and it was like an adjunct to anime and science fiction anyway. So I came into furry through science fiction when furry developed. So how did you guys find it?
Similarly, so I used to, and I used to run a survey. So there used to be a big furry survey, and I used to run that. And I would ask people like, how did you get into it? And the thing is, like, people sometimes still, I think, separate like furry and science fiction, or there's this idea that furry isn't publishable or that it's not mainstream. But like one of the key like risk factors for developing furry was Ringworld. Larry Niven's Xinti were something that people mentioned a lot when they were talking about their gateway, and of course, Clifford Simak wrote furry. Gord Winter Smith wrote furry.
Mm-hmm.
There's a long and storied heritage of H.P. Piper and all of these people who were writing animalish or uplifted anthropomorphic characters back in the day. So that's how I got into it, probably through Ringworld. My father was a bad influence.
Your father was a bad influence.
So how I got into furry? Porn.
Well, that's the big thing.
It's the
Yeah.
big thing now. It wasn't the big thing when I started. The
Yeah.
big thing I started was indie comics, black and white comics.
Yeah.
Like Fusion was science fiction comic from that time, and Albedo was also science fiction.
Fantagraphic stuff.
Yeah. So that was the beginning for me. Boy, Albedo was hard science fiction. That was crunchy stuff, like super social, political, military stuff, and all these talking heads with this long, long like info dump things, and here I am, like I'm in like what, junior high. I'm like, this is the greatest thing ever. It's ridiculous.
I feel like that used to be slightly more common. Like one of the things that stuck with me for 20 years now is there's like a throwaway line in Starship Troopers where Robert Heinlein is talking about the division of the military that uses dogs. They have their like augmented dog soldiers that they fight with. And there's just this throwaway line about how because of their muzzle shape, they can't pronounce certain letters. So you have to, like, the people who work with them have special training because they can't pronounce plosive sounds, the M's and the plosives are like labial consonants, so the M's and the P's and the B's that we need lips to make.
Right.
And so they have this distinctive accent that you have to learn. And like, because Heinlein was not necessarily super hard, but it was something that he thought was interesting and it required some discussion or justification. And it was like, that stuck with him for a long time, that it was something that showed up, was anthropomorphic, and had a science fiction component to it.
It's all over science fiction. It's all over fantasy too. I mean, companion animals and dragons and mainstream genre writing is full of furries. So I'm always kind of confused when people try to separate them. Yeah.
Right, and the advice that we had given yesterday at the writing group panel was, if you're putting work out there, you don't need to be apologetic that it's furry, especially in sci-fi, because we have all this history of talking animals.
Yep.
And actually I'd say it's almost an advantage to like sci-fi and fantasy is, if you're putting out a furry character, you don't need to explain why they're furry. It's speculative. It doesn't matter.
All right. So what do you guys want to know about?
Right.
Or you just waiting for us to be, are you awake yet?
I'm
Good,
awake.
we've got somebody, all right.
awake.
You're awake, awesome. All right, so do you all have any like questions or
Or you want us to, or you
or
want us
you
to
want us
walk
to
in
just
and-
be entertaining?
Entertaining is a good thing.
Yeah, okay. Shoot.
Okay, so I see there are copies of a book called Bleak Horizons there.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about the pull between dystopian, versions of the future and more hopeful versions of the future, and why some people gravitate to one or the other.
I think some of it is, your personal outlook. Primarily what I do is I write science fiction / horror, and actually everything in Bleak Horizons is horror stories. And, they may not be super, super scary, but it's clearly, we've gone out into the unknown, and you can't really conceive of everything, and something bad happens.
Like Event Horizons.
Or Alien Covenant, where I give you all the best advice I've ever given is, if you find a new planet, don't go stomping around on it in your North Face jackets. That really is not a good idea. I'm not a biologist, not a good idea.
I don't do dystopian.
I mean-
Life is hard enough without having it in my fiction. So
Right, and that's as I say, that all your books are very uplifting to me. So
I mean, it's not to say they don't have problems in them.
Right.
But it's a happy universe where awesome things happen, and why wouldn't you want to go there? So that's what I write.
And science fiction has to, science fiction offers a perspective on the world, right? Dystopias in a lot of cases are cautionary tales, or they're ways of extrapolating what somebody sees as a negative or interesting or potentially problematic current issue. And I think one thing that you probably see in furry a little bit is that it sort of emerged in science fiction terms in the midst of this punk revival of countercultural questioning. What does it mean to be human? What does the intersection of humanity and technology mean that we saw in things like Neuromancer or Snow Crash? And this idea, this vaguely transhumanist idea, it pervaded a lot of, I think, early furry writing, at least what I remember. There was a lot of animals as, slave proxies, or the injustice thing of what does it mean when people create furries? I feel like that showed up fairly often.
What does it mean to be human is a question that is in all fiction, and science fiction just has the handy lens of being able to put it from an alien perspective, so people often do. But what does it mean to be human is not always or only, it's a veil of tears and suffering,
Right.
And I think you have to ask yourself what you want to get out of both your writing and your reading when you're doing this, because it's very easy to say, hey, this is a problem and you should be careful because it might happen. But lots of people say that, and it's much harder to say, oh, but here are some ways we could solve or prevent them problems so that we don't have them. It's like, okay, all the critical people who don't tell you how to fix the problem, thanks, I guess, doesn't help.
It's an interesting part of it where when you think, when I think about golden age sci-fi, and I think about people who were coming up in the atomic age, and there's this short period of time where atomic power is going to let everyone have unlimited clean energy, and the polio vaccine has been created, and it looks like infectious disease might be a thing of the past, and global telecommunications have started to make mass media and pop culture something that is global. And there's this sense of optimism that pervades the sci-fi of the 40s, 50s, and 60s that then becomes tempered through Vietnam. And it's interesting that you mentioned it. We kind of laughed it off, but it's really to be raising a kid in this society. We all grew up there was a period in our lives there was a period in my life growing up when my world was what I could bike to. Mm-hmm. It was that neighborhood. And I remember the first time I got online and I realized that there was a whole world out there. I can't imagine how I would say cool, but at least transformationally different it must be to
It's
be growing
awful.
up in
It is
in
awful.
a connected world like that.
Oh, it's awful. No. There's too much of it. They're not ready.
Mm.
They're too, when you're young, you're not ready for the entire world, and yet the entire world is suddenly there, and you have to handle it. And you know, some of her classmates have iPhones and are getting in trouble with them, and you know, people are finding out where they are, and like, no, don't talk to these people. Why can't I talk to them? They seem like nice people. Like, okay, everyone on the internet thinks that you are an adult and a guy, and no, just don't talk to anyone. I'm like, oh, but the world is supposed to be friendly. No, the world is not friendly. It'll be friendly when you're older. It's bad because they're just not ready. It's too much, you know.
I think at the same time, it'll be interesting, I think, to see what people look back on this, like how they look back on this 50 years from now. And I think also...
And it'll be good, because in 50 years it'll be like her issue, and I'll be in a rocking chair doing, oh, let me tell you how to raise your grandchildren, you're doing it wrong. But right now, it's like, I often find myself thinking, okay, in 20 years, she'll be grown up and complaining about me to her friends, but she'll be okay. I'm just going to keep this mental image in mind, you know.
Yeah, on the note of positive science fiction is in regards to humanity, there's this whole section of fiction that I found on some subreddit called HFY, which stands for Humanity F. Yeah, I don't think I need to explain what the F is, but there's one story that's being written on there right now called The Hell Jumper, which, H-E-L, which is the idea of one of humanity's best soldiers winds up on an alien planet. And it's a really interesting story because it's comparing kind of species to species. Humanity and the Calthans, which are, let's just say they're affectionately referred to as feather kittens.
Oh,
So,
cool.
if you have not heard of this story, I highly recommend checking it out. It's being written ongoing right now.
Decision at Duma.
Oh yeah, the head as Salonians.
That was good. Okay, go ahead.
So the question of hopeful future versus despondent future, and science fiction has always been a lens to look at current issues in a distant way. I mean, you look at Star Trek, or you even look at MASH. MASH got to talk about Vietnam War by saying, well, it's in the Korean War. Well, Star Trek got to talk about current issues by simply saying, well, this is on another planet. And, it wasn't, this is hopeful or this is dark. It's that here's an issue that we are dealing with right now, and we're going to solve this issue in this 30-minute, 45-minute block of time. But it allowed them to look at issues and that are happening right now with the distance of, well, this is fictional, and no one here is really over there, so that we can actually talk about this in a frank manner.
And actually, that's a good point. So, a lot of popular franchises, Star Trek, Star Wars, even if bad things were happening, there was still beauty, there was still, Blade Runner.
So
It's
sad.
It's sad and violent
Weeping.
and gritty, but at the end, Roy is talking about all these things that he's seen, and they're just going to be gone when he's gone. And that, well, okay, spoilers. So, if you haven't seen Blade Runner
spoilers for
in like
Blade
40 years now, then
Too late.
sorry.
Actually, the scary thing is there's probably people now who are too young to have even known about Blade Runner. So you are spoiling it for them.
Actually, they would know at least about the new Blade Runner movie and might look up the old one.
They might,
That is
yes.
certainly true.
Yes, I heard the new one was interesting.
The new one I really liked, so if you have not seen it, you should see it. Even if the very least that you get out of it is the cinematography is just amazing.
But I think, I think it's, you can't really call Star Trek total issue fiction because half of it was fluff. It was,
Right.
it was fluff. And, when I look back, I grew up with the original Star Trek. When I look back on Next Generation, which I saw as it was coming out, And now when I try to watch Next Generation again, I'm like, oh God, it's just like endless message fiction. It doesn't wear well, you know. Well, like the old Star Trek, you know, there's enough, it takes itself less seriously enough that, you know, at least I can watch it and not feel like they're beating me on the head with, let's examine this through the lens of science fiction because you obviously haven't thought about it yet. You know, it's like, oh God. You know, not all fiction is intentionally a message, and you can use it that way, but I think a lot of people are clumsy with that particular instrument, and it's very difficult to do it well.
Sometimes you just gotta use fiction and have fun.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I like to write fun things, because I like to read fun things. Not apologetic for that.
Yeah, I think you sort of see the contrast there between Star Trek and Farscape. Whereas Star Trek, there's a lot of issues in human exceptionalism, especially, like humans are going to be the new Qs eventually. That's why Q's watching them.
Right.
And then on Farscape, it's like, Crichton, you're useless at everything. We're better at everything, and we're just going to have space adventures.
Right.
Everything's fun, and
Crichton-
humans don't have to be the center of attention.
And yet Crichton shows, he's ignorant on a lot of things that they do, he still helps them out and gets them out of trouble.
That's
Yeah.
true. And he fell through a wormhole, so he has things in his brain.
It's hard to make judgments like that for TV because TV is limited by their budget for special effects. So you could want to make tons of aliens and have them be the center of the show, but the amount of money you would need to pull that off is just, it's just easier to have, these are humans in space than it is to have like cool bird people in space, It's just,
Well, that's probably also why Farscape went with Jim Henson for two of the aliens.
I remember.
Yeah, they were actual puppets.
And what was weird was that the original series of Star Trek seemed to have more aliens than later series of Star Trek.
Yeah,
Yeah.
A lot of it was sort of clever, like off-screen things happening, or use of the camera to make sure that people never got a very good look at what they were talking to. But
I
it
like the
worked.
Horta,
Yeah.
the little pizza.
I like the Gorn.
But even with Star Trek, there were more aliens in the Star Trek novels than there were in the series. And the novels were great.
And actually, in one Star Trek novel, there were dragons.
Which one?
Here be dragons.
Well,
I thought I'd read all of it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
in this
animated
book,
series.
there's this planet that actually, the natural growth of the animals there actually created, the dragons evolved on that planet. And then there's this one alien race that wanted to, for some reason, implant humans there. So during their time when they were thinking that human race was in the medieval stage and they believed in dragons, go like, you know what, these guys believe in dragons, these look like those creatures, let's take these guys, put them there.
Huh, I don't remember that one. And I read so many Star Trek novels, like a crazy amount of them. In fact, I tried to buy them all on Kindle once they came out. I'm like, oh God, if I bought every single one that I've read, I would be paying like $400. It's just crazy. But
Yeah, look it up, you'll love it.
I probably will.
Did you know that the Horda was a modification of an Outer Limits monster?
I believe it.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's actually sort of an interesting, like, from a science fiction writing perspective here, because there's this like limit of there's a certain kind of genre of fiction that is like the alienness of aliens, because in most cases they need to be human enough for us to have some
Yes.
form of connection. So this idea, like things like Arrival, or like stories where figuring out how to communicate with them or figuring out how they work is the plot. When you guys are writing, when you're creating things, how do you balance that? Like, how do you balance making alien cultures interesting or like distinct or unique without making them incomprehensible or making them unsympathetic or unrecognizable?
No, you go first. Because basically, when I write alien cultures, I tend to make them scary and slimy and tentacles and things like that. And so,
And
Well-
some people actually find that attractive.
I suppose that's true.
like anime. Always miserable.
And those poor schoolgirls.
That's part of that.
I guess the answer is, I like observing cultures, and I have immigrant parents, so I'm a first-generation American, and I was born in a city with many, many cultures that were very distinct and not totally okay with each other. There was a lot of friction. So I had this culture that I came from, the one that I was born into, and all of its multiple issues, and I'm completely lost because my parents can't help me. They didn't even know what the Easter Bunny was. So, you know, all the kids in school, oh, wow, the Easter Bunny's coming. My parents were like, oh, quick, go to the dime store and buy something. You know, like, you know, what's a tooth? Why is there a tooth fairy? I don't know why there's a tooth fairy. Why am I the tooth fairy? I don't know. So, to me, when you see enough of the weirdness of actual humans, you start seeing, okay, well, there's multiple ways to approach all your life, and then you just, if you observe enough of it, you start, because I've read science fiction where the point is the aliens are unknowable, and it's a very specific story that's trying to give you a very specific experience of the unknown and, you know, your discomfort with the unknown, and you know, the existential issues with, I can never understand what's going on, and that's not my thing. So my thing is, I'm facing someone who looks pretty much like me, or, you know, is cool looking, and yet I can't quite,
Right.
I keep tripping and not figuring out why we're not quite communicating. So, you know, to me that's the story I like. So that's my focus when I create those aliens, is to create an ability to give readers that experience. That's what I like, so. Now you have to answer.
I mean, I feel very similar. I mean, yeah, my father is my father is first generation, so I'm second generation. I live overseas. I've lived overseas for 7 years, and so I am aware that alienness does not necessarily need to mean complete incomprehensibility. It can mean even things that I think of as being familiar. I had to get over the fact that, to the extent that Mexican food exists in Germany, guacamole is often made with mayonnaise,
What?
which is a very, very unfortunate.
Yes, yes, I think it would
So,
be.
but I mean, it's also, for me, generally speaking, yeah, I think there can be interesting things in, you know, either the ineffable, like, majesty of alienness or the chthonic horror of the void. I think those can be interesting stories, but for me, it generally is this is something that is not human or not like me, but I can see enough of myself in it, or I can see the experiences that I have had being in an airport in a foreign country and nobody speaking the language, or.
Ooh, yeah. So that's a good question. Why do you like science fiction?
I like science fiction because there are so many things that we don't know, and it kind of gives you the opportunity to explore those. As I said, I like the idea of all these things that we find, you know, beautiful and worthy and part of us, finding them out there, and unfortunately in my case, then trying to kill you. But I mean, I like the world building, you know, both because you can, when you world build in science fiction, you can not only take things that exist now, but you can springboard off of them and say, like, okay, well, so right now, you know, so back in the 50s, you know, this would be science fiction. So now in 50, 100 years, what is the evolution of this?
Implants.
Well, yes, or, well, and I have a dystopia story that you don't want to go that far. But, you know, so then in 50 years, do you have mainframes? In 50 years, do we still have this because this somehow ended up being the peak of technology, which I don't really hope.
Well, I think it's interesting because technology marches through human foibles. So, you know, you could say, well, it's going to be an implant, but it's just as likely that people will be like, no, I reject having anything added to my body, and that's kind of creepy, and I don't want to go there. And then we don't do that. It's like the mainframes. Well, we went away from mainframes. Now we got the cloud, and we basically access the cloud through terminal applications. So the mainframe sort of came back in a new form. So it's, you know, it's idiosyncratic, which is interesting, because then you can't assume rational progression of anything, because humans are not rational.
I feel like of something that we can look at that's happening now is something that was science fiction. Everyone always said, yes, we want that, that has to be a thing, and right now it is kind of becoming a thing, but people are still wondering just how integrated and how much will VR actually really become part of our culture. Right now it's just being used for video games, and people are still unsure because of things like price, whether it's just a gimmick, all that sort of stuff, if it's going to stick. If it sticks, we'll have great advances in VR, and it will become a massive thing. But if it doesn't, because it's too expensive, nobody wants to use it because it's just gimmicky games, nobody can afford it or anything like that, it might just die out, and VR might end up not being a thing.
Right.
It's interesting to see how that's going to go.
So why do you want it?
Porn will save it.
Why
We'll
did you
see.
get
They
it?
started putting it out there.
Most tech starts out really expensive. Look at VCRs.
True. That's true.
I get into science fiction because I was raised on it. My dad had a complete collection of Locus up until Locus and Analog and all of these like things that I was brought up steeped in it. And I think there's an interesting optimism to it. I have on my arm, I have tattooed the map of the Pioneer space probe, the map of the solar system that went out of the Pioneer plaque. And I tell people that it's so that I will never be, more lost than the nearest planet. But actually, it's because I think there's actually something really, really interesting to a culture that built a probe and sent it out into the universe with a map on it and a line that points back to Earth. And there is an optimism there that says, we think the universe is worth exploring and interesting, and we hope that you feel the same way. And if you do and you want to meet us, here's how. And today that sounds naive, and people are like, oh, that's a really bad idea. But I think that's really cool. I think that there's something really interesting and really, really kind of honest and genuine about that old view of the world. And so, I was brought up in the rocket ship Galileo style of science fiction, and that's what I like about it. I like that it still feels like a space that you can be kind of optimistic and naive about the future.
So the future that comes, I want your aliens to follow the map, not your aliens.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
I'd love his aliens follow it.
Well, we have an awesome tradition in science fiction of being the most violent, like, warmongers in the entire galaxy, so I think we'll handle it.
Actually, I did want to ask you specifically, because you write so many things that are the cosmic horror, we get out there and there's something bigger and badder than us.
Yeah.
What is your take on the we get out there and it turns out that humanity is the big bad of the universe?
I have a story about that.
Wait a minute, how many stories have you written?
I have probably 20 that I just sort of keep to myself. Mostly because, so when I write, so far I tend to chase markets, and so it's like, oh.
You chase furry markets.
I chase furry markets.
Okay.
And so it's you want a story about a dystopia. Oh, well, I have a story that's kind of dystopian. I can tailor it and switch it around. I think that is certainly a cool aspect of it. That, certainly there are plenty of stories where we do get out there and, oh crap, we're the enemy, we're the bad ones. Because like there are certainly aspects of culture of colonialism where we clearly went somewhere and said, we know you guys have your way of doing things, but our way is the best. We'll just put that on top of your way. And clearly that didn't work out very well for everybody involved, especially the people who were being colonized. So I think I'm rambling.
He wants to know what you think of humans being the evil ones, but I guess you wrote a story about that.
Yeah, and I think that probably, it's a nice aspect of it. When I wrote that story, again, it's very clearly anti-colonial, and I think it's nice to give them some type of redemption, some way of, eventually we get it that we're not the best things in sliced bread, and you can switch it around.
I like sliced bread.
I like sliced bread too. It is the best thing.
Betty White.
I feel like you. So we have
Yeah.
we have a question, but I feel like you also need
Right.
to answer the question that you have posed.
Right.
of
So-
why you got into science fiction.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So hold on, we'll get back to you when.
I guess I'm an incurable optimist, and I want, I believe that we came here we were born for a reason, and it wasn't to suffer and be miserable. And we weren't brought into the world to bring up more people in the world to be miserable and suffer. So I'm sorry. But so I basically believe that there's a benevolent presence that says, you know what, the future is worth it, and you want to be around for it, and you want to have children to be around for it. So for me, science fiction, I grew up with Star Trek. Yes, we're going to go out there and it's going to be awesome, and I still believe that. So.
As long as we meet a bunch of alien races like the Gorn.
Yes.
Well, there's bad people everywhere. That doesn't change that overall things are pretty awesome. Right?
Or you could go the other route and become a Captain Kirk, and just find all the hot aliens.
What? The Gorn are hot?
Okay, moving on.
Well, first, didn't Kirk wind up making friends with the Gorn at the end of that episode? Or at least, they weren't enemies anymore?
I don't remember.
I seem to recall them getting blown up a
Yeah,
tiny
I
bit.
thought he shot it with his rudimentary,
But
he
then he
did
spared
it.
its life, and the alien came along and said, well, you humans have potential after all.
Yeah, although I don't think it was the Gorn that said it. It was whatever had put
Yes.
Kirk and the
Yeah,
Gorn
the
on.
Metreon, I think they're called.
Oh yeah.
But anyway, I was gonna get back to the evolution of technology thing, which is, what if the technology evolves and it's disappointing? Like, one of the standard lines you hear when people discuss, we don't have the Jetsons type future is, where's my jetpack? And, jetpacks have been around since the 60s, but they're not very safe, and they can only hold enough fuel for a few minutes of flight at a time.
Right. Well, that's actually let me springboard off of that to you were talking about VR. VR has been around for a really long time. I remember back in the 80s, people like, oh, I'm going to walk around in my wizardry, 3D maze. And,
oh my gosh, you remember Wizardry.
Lawnmower Man.
Yeah, and so we've been on the cusp of people actually putting out VR and putting us in VR environments, and it just hasn't really materialized. And now finally we're getting things where it's like, okay, my technology in my phone is good enough that I can put my phone on little VR goggles and have a nice, reasonable environment. But I think, that if the technology ends up disappointing, we're not, as Maggie was saying, maybe there's cultural reasons why it's disappointing. Maybe there's technical reasons why it's disappointing.
Social reasons.
Social reasons.
Economic reasons.
That too.
Yeah. So.
If it doesn't, then we do something else. It's the human experience is just this rushing river, and it just goes around all the obstacles while it's heading wherever it's heading. So if we don't have VR, we'll end up with something else that we spend all the time doing. Oh yeah, I've got my newest Candy Crush. That'll keep me occupied.
And it's something to keep in mind, I think, when you talk about more speculative fiction, that if you look at science fiction visions of the future, they're all wrong.
Right.
And people extrapolate from what they know, and so you have everybody in Robert Heinlein's future, and I think the first Star Trek was still using slide rules to calculate their orbital trajectories. And in Star Trek, you see, people kind of figured that mainframes would get smaller, and maybe they thought that you would have a computer that could show some, tablet would show some information, but not necessarily be connected to everything. It would itself be a computer. Nobody, I think, thought about and people figured out, because, the Enterprise can talk to Starfleet Command from wherever they are in the galaxy, and people got that. They didn't get what mass media would look like. And there are still, things in Babylon 5 where there's an Earth reporter who interviews Captain Sheridan, and nobody got that. Our news today is largely citizen journalists, for lack of a better word, that people get their news from social media or from their friends or from the fact that everybody has a camera and everybody can take that information and put it on the World Wide Web. And for better or for worse, that's, I think, something that people didn't foresee. And you have to choose what you're extrapolating from,
Right.
because
That's okay. I mean, you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Orville actually did an episode on that where there was an entire planet that was up to old Earth standards, and it was pretty much literally the majority rule. The entire planet voted on if you were a good person or a bad person by
Oh,
the
yes, yeah.
pictures that people took and shared.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so before we go on, this is like a panel on science fiction writing, and I want to make sure nobody has questions on actual writing of science fiction as opposed to rambling about how cool science fiction is and its
Right.
many permutations. So if you have like an actual question, please, about that, we don't
Yes.
want to miss that, so.
Yeah.
Good
Okay.
question to ask is, if you have a story you're writing,
Yeah.
in this day and age, how would you get it published? And to whom?
Who do you want to read it? Oh, well, I mean,
I-
answer
I-
the question.
I'm sorry, but I was kind of asking a hypothetical, so I didn't have a direct answer.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Well, you have to know who you want to read it before you can decide how and where you want to publish it. You know, if you want primarily furries to read it, you're going to put it somewhere differently than if you want a bunch of random strangers on the internet to read
Figure
it.
out your target audience.
Mhm.
Well, you have to know what your intention is, right?
Right.
So,
like inside of furry, I'm not sure there is. Some of the publishers will put out, calls for, we're accepting novellas, we're accepting novels, we're accepting. Some of them will put out that we're accepting anthology topics for short stories. I think a bunch of them, like Fur Planet, has certainly moved away from putting out a bunch of anthologies. They have their standard sort of claw, roar, fang, and they will probably continue those. But I don't think that, at least Fur Planet, is actively searching for anthologies. But so that's paid markets, or some of the publishers don't pay and they give you a contributor copy. But that doesn't stop you from
So sad.
self-publishing. Segue
artists
to Maggie.
should be paid.
Artists should be paid.
Artists should be paid, and writers are artists.
And that is actually one of the things that as an aside, in my writing group, I complain about a lot because it's like, oh, this is a great anthology call, and read. Oh, and they don't pay, they give me a book. Well, okay, sorry guys.
I don't even have any space for more books. Like, where am I
Exactly.
going to put it? I'm like, oh, thank you so much for this copy.
Right.
Maybe.
Which
I'll-
then I'll either keep or I'll give away because.
Yeah, no. I sell to the general public because that's the only way that I can make enough money to make a living. Because furry is too small to make a living off of, unless you're doing very, very specific small things. Like I think there are some people who are doing erotica commissioned writing who make enough money to not have a day job. Maybe. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I think there are a few, and I think particularly in like a Patreon world,
Yeah.
I know a few people
Right.
who are Patreoners, and I suspect that's what they're writing.
So unless you're you're targeting that market specifically and going for it aggressively, the only way to make enough money to not have multiple jobs is to sell to the general public. So that's what I do, and that guides all my choices for what I write and how long it is and what it hits. I mean, I love what I write. I'm lucky because what I love to write is not like hard, deep stuff that people have to be convinced to read. It's all fluff adventure with space elves and pirates and furries and stuff like that. It's stuff you would read on Saturday afternoon and finish in 2 hours and be like, hey, that was great, I was entertained, and now I'm moving on. That's not a hard sell for a lot of people. So, that's where I put things. And I love furries and I love furry writing and if Fred Patton comes to me and says, Maggie, do you have something lying around that I can pay you $25 for and put in an anthology? I'm like, well, if I can find something, you can have it, but I can't afford to write
Right.
for $25 in a contributor copy because it's awesome, but I can't. But that's like not even 1 week's groceries.
Oh yeah.
So that's my choice. But to be a career writer is, you have to make specific choices that mean you don't get to do any sort of thing you want. You have to do specifically things that sell to people strangers who would buy it. So that's not for everybody, and that's okay. You know, if you don't want to do that, you write what you want to do and not have to worry about whether it sells. And you want to go and do something else, which, what do you do?
I mean, that's what I do. I mean, I have a day job that I like. Writing is a largely a hobby for me. So I write, I post things online. I sell things to people sometimes, or I've put together a couple of ebooks and sold them. But that's my distribution channel is largely the people who have discovered my writing in the last 15 years of doing it. And it's fun for me because people enjoy it and people like it and they do cool things with it, and that's kind of my validation.
This is a totally valid choice that people really play down, which is, I'm gonna get a job so that I can write or do the art that I want to without the stress of having to sell it. That's really people are like, oh, but then I can't do it all the time. And I'm like, yeah, but you probably won't enjoy doing it all the time as much as you think you would.
Right.
So, whenever people are like, I have a day job and I also do this thing, I'm like, yes, go you, because you don't have to answer to anybody to do the creative thing that you want. This is totally okay. And, people play it down all the time, and I think that's not fair because it's a good choice.
And to be clear, I have done freelance writing before, and I could not do it full time. And mad respect to you for being able to do it. I could not.
It is, you have to do 3 to 5 novels a year.
Yeah.
So, and they have to be 3 to 5 novels a year that are marketable to a broad audience. It's not for everybody. Sometimes I don't think it's for me, but I bought a computer. It was really cool. I'm like, I need a new computer. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm gonna buy just enough computer to run Word and Photoshop. And nothing, no World of Warcraft, no Final Fantasy, no cool games, nothing off Steam. It practically doesn't do social media very well. I'm like, all I can do is Word and occasionally some, editing of minor graphics. And I'm like, this is great. It'll mean I'll only work. So I bought it and I set it up and I'm like, this is great. And then I tried to run WoW on it and here's my character.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, so that didn't work. And the poor computer, it's so hot and the fan is going constantly.
Oh, yeah.
I'm like, okay, so I'll just set that up. I'm like, this is great. It actually works. All I can do is work. And I'm like, I want to play a game, but I guess I'll just keep writing. And everybody's like, you need to relax. And I'm like, I can't. I've got nothing else I can do on this computer.
And that's where you get older games that will run on it, that need lesser
or
resources.
I did that for a while, and I did play Caesar 3, clubs are needed. It was really great, but you can only do that so many times before you're like, okay, I've ruled Rome enough, I need to move on.
StarCraft and rule the world as Zerg.
Well, Master of Magic and Master of Orion, all those fun old games. I'm like, oh, this is great. But
Master of Orion.
that was good. But, you play them and you're like, okay, I'm done. I've done this before.
Right.
I even got I got Wizardry running.
As I say, Wizardry.
Wizardry was great. And the funny thing is, my dad still had the maps that he drew. My dad is a mechanical engineer, so he had drafting paper and graphical stuff, and he went and did all the maps by hand with his pencil and the ruler and stuff like that, and gridded them out and everything. And I still had all those old maps that he did of every level, because of course, back in the old days, games were hardcore and they didn't give you maps anywhere, so you could get lost and die down there and never come out. So I'm like, great, I have the maps, I'm gonna play Wizardry. Unlike the time I was 12 when I was doing this, I'm gonna be brave and go past the first level. Didn't do it. I couldn't do it. Oh my God, I'm scared. There's no real map, and all I've got is my father's. It was passed down to me, and yet.
your legacy.
I guess you shouldn't try playing Zork.
I love Zork, but I couldn't get. I had to cheat. I had to buy the cheats, which back then in the '80s, you had to you mail order them or something like that to get.
Or talk to a friend that had it.
Right.
In person.
Said maps are pure science fiction. Maps.
Right. All right. So we had a question in the back there.
Yep. Back on the topic of aliens, one thing I've noticed in a lot of lower quality, maybe science fiction stories, is that a lot of alien species are basically described with only like one or two notable traits,
Yeah.
I could say. Like there's that race of warriors, that race of these guys,
Planet of Cats.
and it kind of clashes. I always said it clashed with humanity, because we humans are all different. Some of us are more violent than others. Some of us are older, so
Yeah.
so what I would really love to see in science fiction is more alien species that show more diversity themselves too.
Right.
Basically.
Right. And you
Like-
know, because like in my story in Bleak Horizons, my aliens are basically tentacle beasts that are just trying to kill you for no reason other than they're existing because I needed a setting that was scary and kind of hopeless, but I described the creatures minimally because I wanted to let people sort of extrapolate, oh, I see tentacles and teeth, and you can picture in your mind probably something scarier than I can sit there. And, yeah, exactly. Well, much smaller Cthulhu, because Cthulhu wakes up and goes, these continents aren't where I thought they were. Whereas my things were just like trying to eat you and not like everything.
Yeah, and other also Lovecraftian beasts because they tend to all have tentacles.
Exactly.
I think
So yeah.
that's
So yeah. Basically, I'm tired of the Planet of Hats trope, you could say.
Right.
but that's
And-
like a space thing. I think a lot of that is to do that well. You need a story long enough to,
Right.
to
Yeah,
get
that
it
is
across, or else it's just
I-
confusing.
I personally had a very funny idea
Mm.
of a species that is usually warmongering, but they have a subset that they literally call hippies,
Yeah.
who want to celebrate the human culture, or the cultures of the species they're trying to conquer.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
cute.
You should write that.
There's something to like an element of that I think is that there's some degree of I think additional cognitive load in expanding when things become more complex. I'm rewatching Babylon 5, and there's an episode very early on when they're still finding themselves. And the arc device of the episode is that Earth has decided that every culture on the planet, every culture on the station should have their dominant religion do their religious ceremony as a cross-cultural experience. And so the Centauri have their a feast, and the Minbari have this they do a exchange with sacred fruit. And then because it's 90s sci-fi, at the end it's the captain's turn to do Earth's dominant religion, and it's just this line of people, and he's like, this is John, he's an atheist, and this is so and so, he's a Greek Orthodox priest. This is so and so else, he's a Muslim. And it's just then the closing shot is them panning down this long line of people because Earth is diverse and these things. But as things became more developed and you learned that the Minbari were actually more complex and there was this caste that did this thing and then there was this term for it, you go down this rabbit hole where you kind of have to ask your reader to remember that these aliens are not all like this. It's this this city behaves this way and this religious caste in that city behaves this way. So the way that it tends to be boiled down is the race does this thing, aliens behaving this way, and then you have the one subversion that is the peaceful Klingon, or the Vulcans who are trying to rediscover emotion, because that's just honestly it's a lot simpler for us as readers to be able to parse.
And I want to say, this is really an important point because you really can't overload your readers that way. I can do that, but I have a canonical universe that has 20 novels and 20, 30 short stories in it. So I can afford to do those pieces because there's enough space that people can get used to all the stereotypes and then move out fractally into everything else. But you can't really communicate that without confusion very easily in very little space.
I would also say that it depends, because if a spaceship landed in Sparta, they would see humans as all warriors.
Right.
If the spaceship landed in Amish country, these are really nice farmers. And so you're only getting a snapshot of what it is that they're interacting with.
Right. So yeah, you have you're out in space and you run into the warlike race. Well, they're warlike because, let's say, all of, it's like their policy was, oh man, space is scary. We better put all of our warriors into space.
Right.
Let's keep all our explorers at home, developing, universal healthcare and stuff. And so that and it's only afterwards when you find their home planet and you say, oh wow, that's great. Let's get our cancer treatment done. Actually, the person in red, and we'll go back to you.
I have a sort of frame device for that one, and one of the things I'm working on where the wizard, it's a young wizard being taught by an incredibly old wizard. And he's being taught all these sort of, this is how elves act, this is how dwarves act, etc. And it turns out that ancient wizard had fought in a lot of wars, and he was just a racist.
Yeah. Well, and that's actually like Lovecraft was a terrible old racist. But he also wrote Doom That Came to Sarnath, which is actually a very, very good anti-colonial story and actually almost anti-racist. And you kind of wonder how he managed to, was this an actual, paradigm shift inside of Lovecraft? Or was it just a one-off and oh, that's a cool idea. What if people weren't all racist like me? So
Authors are complicated.
exactly, we're all human, or other things.
All right, so
I was going to mention that one of the book series that I read ages ago kind of did the whole idea where it was all simple ideas. Oh, this alien race is evil. This is the good alien race. These alien races are working for the evil guys, so they are evil. So they are evil, and then took it and went later on and went, yeah, it turns out that evil group is only evil because A, they kind of have to be, and two, they're actually completely oppressed by the high group, and most of them aren't actually evil and just wish they didn't have to do that.
Right.
And there's good guys, well, they're actually not that good, but the not that good group is actually just, the military. And that's all we've been experienced.
I think
They kind of
fiction lately
deconstruct that.
has been going on this trend towards nuance when showing characters and such.
I'm actually trying to work on a story on that line, but in the fantasy realm with the kobolds and all that, where kobolds aren't evil, they just do that because, well, it's one way to get certain points across, and the other good races expect them to do that anyways.
In the back there?
I noticed Rob is running his Remember the Camp shirt there. So, say hey, I really dig the aesthetic of the Expanse, but I wanted to have a lot more dog people in it. What would be your process for, I guess, making that meaningful other than, I went and made Miller a dog?
So, this question can go to the panel, but my approach to it, honestly, I write, most of the people, I write for furries, and so a lot of that process is, what do furries want to see? And furries, the stuff that I write, I write a diverse range of things, but the sci-fi gets read, people like it, people want to do things with it, and so my approach would be, what are species, archetypes in the furry fandom that I think these characters map to, or that I think, what would a scrappy mechanic look like? What would a resistance fighter look like? What are these, what are the species archetypes that people expect to see? Could I do something interesting with that? Could I play against type? Could I find a species that is underrepresented, and if the raccoons discover that I've created a raccoon scrappy mechanic, and they'll just get really into it and signal boost it. But that's largely it. I don't if I'm writing in a hard sci-fi setting and I'm doing the thing where these are uplifts who have been designed because they're working on a planet that requires them to be dog people for some reason, then I would find a way to justify that. But generally speaking, it would be, what do I think this would look like? What do I think furries would like reading about in The Expanse, which is medium hard sci-fi with orbital mechanics and then additional dog people. But
what was the question? Specifically, 'cause
writing. You see a science fiction show you like. You see an aesthetic you like. You really like Thunderbirds or Star Wars or something like that. But you also really like animal people. what do you do to make that gel, to make that interesting, to make that, in your case, sellable? I think also I don't know, I don't think you necessarily went into this thinking like, yeah, I really like, I want to do Star Wars, but
No, but I did. But I was like 14 when I wrote my first story in the canonical universe. Like, God help me, I'm still writing it. So, I have George Lucas problems, right? Oh boy. So, in fact, I started so early that by the time I got to the end of high school, I drew a little comic where my characters were like, we have to have a meeting. And they all gathered them and they all said, so what's the problem? It has been brought to our attention that we are too much like Star Trek. So I'm like making fun of my younger self because it's basically I want Star Trek with unicorns and furries and more aliens and just went from there. And so, I'm afraid the answer to that for me was I needed like 2.5 decades to make it work because I started so young that I didn't really have a clear idea of what I wanted beyond, oh, this is really cool, and I want to throw some furries in it, and some aliens, and some unicorns. Oh, God, I removed the unicorns, because they were God mode. I'm like, no, God. 14-year-old me, high school me. 14-year-old me, you just did not understand the way this is supposed to work. Like, okay, we're removing the unicorns. 14-year-old me, no, not the unicorns.
The unicorns are Mary Sue's.
Yeah.
Yeah, they really were. It was pretty sad. But you have to figure out what is it about the thing that you like, that you want to do. Like, okay, what is it about Star Trek that I liked, that I want for myself? And then you take that little piece of it, which doesn't really have anything to do with like the dressing, the set dressing, and you pull it out and you start fresh from that. Like, I like the optimism. I like the multiculturalism. I like the adventure part. I just take all those pieces and I put them over there, and then I start building the stuff that I like around it. So I keep the spirit of it, but I just add what I like to it. That's how I would do it.
Sci-fi, you have the advantage that, as we said, there is a huge, huge history of we have cat people, we have dog people, we have whatever, we have giant otters that live on a moon around Corellia in Star Wars. So. In furry, if you want to have dog people, you put your dog people in. I would say, echoing both of them, that if I'm putting in dog people, there probably should be some type of reason why they're dogs and not cats and not, otters.
But it can be a completely
Whimsical reason.
Yeah, it can be. It'd be like, well, the lead scientist on the project was a dog person and hated cats, so they just picked dogs because he wouldn't work on anything else.
Right.
Because real life actually works that way. Sometimes decisions get made based on weird stuff like that, and then it creates stories that people like us are like, you wouldn't believe how this started, and because it really works that way.
Fidget spinners are a thing somehow.
Yeah.
Because someone thought it was fun.
Yeah.
I think the catch of the thing to keep in mind possibly is also your audience, because I feel like species archetypes, or if you see something in a fantasy setting, and particularly if you're writing things that are a little bit more whimsical, but like what general audiences expect, how general audiences expect a dog to behave or a cat to behave are not necessarily what furry audiences would expect a dog or a cat to behave.
That is true.
And I think there's a lot of intersection, and I think the more mainstream furry stuff, I think comics do this. I'm thinking like Free Fall is a good example of a comic that does that well. But I think that would be a thing to keep in mind.
I will admit this question is entirely tongue-in-cheek, but if you're creating a world where you have the thing that's new and exciting and you're interested in, and you make the story all about that, how do you avoid being the next Stephanie Meyer?
Do you know how much money Stephanie Meyer made? Can I be the next Stephanie Meyer? I have no problem with that. Okay, now let me go at that. You said tongue-in-cheek, but I'm going to go after it. Stephanie Meyer was writing for a specific audience, and you are not it.
Yeah.
So you find it mock-worthy. Okay, but I read her books, and I'm like, when I was a teenager, I would have eaten this whole with a spoon and called, hallelujah, this is great, I want more. Okay, she pegged her audience, which is not all of us in this room.
Oh, yeah.
It's teenage girls,
Yeah.
you know? And I don't think it's okay to say, okay, you know, grumpy, right? Okay, it's not okay to say, you know what? What's wrong with you writing this weird horror stuff? Don't you have like a happy thought in your head? You must be a depressing person. Like, what is wrong with you, Stephanie Meyer fans? What? Don't you get this is stalking? Can't you read like real fiction? Everybody reads something that someone else thinks is stupid. So why rain on their parade about it?
Especially when they're rolling around in lots of money. as
Now,
well.
well, and teenage girls read a lot of books. They love books. So if you're going to write a book for teenage girls and you make a good one that appeals to them, you make tons of money. Good for you.
Yeah, just
you
make
know?
sure that you have vampires in it, that they sparkle.
Hey, I think sparkling is cool.
Yeah, definitely.
Glitter is awesome.
This is, I think, yeah, we can stay on a soapbox for a bit. I think this is something that like science fiction in particular is extremely bad about, and we should probably keep an eye on, because we think there's this tendency to make things hierarchical, or to like talk about hard sci-fi as though hard sci-fi is intrinsically better than some other dimension of sci-fi. A lot of it is niche, and a lot of it's understanding your niche and targeting it. But I mean, we're doing a lot of reading these days, and there's a lot of niches to target, and there's a lot of interesting stuff that can be done in there. And sometimes there are interesting things that can be done around subverting the expectations of a particular genre. But a lot of it is just understanding who you're writing for, and particularly when you go to For a Planet at the Sofa Wolf table, they know who they're writing for, and that also is not necessarily mainstream audiences. But I think that's something to keep in mind, generally speaking, not just with young adult fantasy.
I just wanted to say that, you know, all this talk of know your audience and be writing to a specific audience and all that stuff, your audience can also just be you. I'm writing this for me. This is the kind of thing that I like, and so anybody who likes exactly the thing that I like will be attracted to this. I mean, everybody will like something, or for everything that exists, there exists someone out there that likes. There may be 5 people, and those 5 people will love that thing. That thing.
Right.
That is not a failure, but I mean, you don't have to try to appease a target audience. You can just do it for your love of it, and just let those people come to you.
And that's why you have day jobs, you know, so that you can do that and not worry about the financial implications of it.
Right.
But if you're the kind of person who likes, you know, you write it for yourself and you're a niche reader and there's like 40 people like you, you know, okay, 40 people will read it. If you're happy with that, that's great, you know. But if you aren't happy with that, then yes, you have to wonder, well, how can I get more readers?
Right.
And I think furries often aim too low. I think furries often think, oh, you know, the only people who want to read my work is furries, so I shouldn't try to do anything beyond For a Planet or so forth, which is great stuff. But I think they underestimate how many mainstream people love furries. I mean, they might not call them furries, they might not think of themselves as categorically furries, but they'll go see Guardians of the Galaxy and love the tree and the raccoon, and what is that? That's totally furry.
Right.
So, you know, why would you say to yourself, you know, I'm obviously a niche writer who can only appeal to people who like animals, when people who like animals are everywhere.
Right.
So, you know?
Look at Disney. They built themselves on that.
I think that also relates to a question that you asked earlier around where you, what your publication channels are and how you get things out there. I would honestly say the phrase target things too low, even within the fandom. We do a lot, because there's a lot of stuff that's getting published. And we just, like the anthology that came out, the Claw anthology that came out, I'm not certain that people assumed for some reason that there was a market for female scientific fiction, and it sold out in like 2 hours.
Yeah.
Wow.
So like that's something where even targeting within even within the fandom and looking at what anthologies have open calls and things like that, that you will discover that what you view as niche or what you view as like who you are writing for can be broad, and there's a pretty big audience here. Again, to be clear, I don't think there is room for a whole lot of people to be making their living, like to quit their day job and become a furry fan and targeting writer. But I do think that we greatly underestimate the degree to which the fandom has an appetite for consuming a diverse and wide-ranging degree of written work.
Since we have kind of questions, I was going to say one thing I want to talk about is so aspects of technology can be implemented in your story both as, basically the let's say even the finger of God to help you solve a problem, but they can also be put in as a challenge to overcome. So, for example, communications. You brought up communications before. So, in, let's say, in Ender's Game, and there's a big tradition of the Ansible, which is instantaneous communication between any 2 points in the very, very large universe, and how this makes so many things, impossibly easy. Like, in Ender's Game, wiping out a civilization, where all of our commanders are here on Earth or orbiting neutron stars or whatever, and all the fleets are millions of light years away. Now, if you take another aspect of that, what if communication takes a while? So in Ender's Game, what if Ender is sitting here on Earth giving his commands to the fleet, and it basically says, okay, so in 6 years, I need my fleet to be here. So you send them out at light speed. What happens if things have changed in the meantime? The fleet gets there, you've made peace. This is amazing. You sent out the fleet, and the aliens came to Earth and said, you know what, we were totally wrong. Blue is a great color. We don't know why we even started this. So can we just be friends? That's great. How do you get your fleet back? Do you send more ships after them? Do you work on technology to improve your communications? Do you work on technology to make your ships faster so you can get there before your ships? Do you kill your fleet? And so I think that's an area that you can really work into your stories. Don't just assume that your communications instantaneous. You can work with things.
So is science fiction about technology?
I think there's a lot of crossover between the technology. I mean, and that's so my background is physics and working at NASA, and so a lot of my favorite stories have things like Ansible, where they sometimes describe how it works. I mean, the concept I think between Ansible that is established is you take quantum entanglement. So you have, so we're gonna go into hard sci-fi for a second here. So you have quantum pairs, and so you have upstate and a downstate. So if somehow you take your paired items, you separate them by light years. If you change this one to a down, this one will flip up. And so you have binary, you can make basically Morse code out of your flipping quantum states. And through quantum entanglement, this should be instantaneous. So you have a basis for instantaneous communication everywhere. We haven't really got it working because we don't have instantaneous communication.
This is a point I want to make.
Yeah.
Your physics, cartography, math.
I majored in anthropology.
Well, okay, okay, anthropology. I like biology and linguistics, and I did coding. So the stuff that he puts in his book about physics, I'll just accept and be like, whatever. Whereas if I was someone who was into physics, I would be able to see if he did anything wrong. The problem is, you will always do something wrong because you are interested in the stuff you're interested in, and you do not have time to research everything in the universe.
Right.
And you still have to put those things in your work because they still exist. So be prepared going in that someone is going to come up to you one day and say, like they do to me, the gravity on your planets doesn't make any sense. I'm like, sorry? Wasn't really the focus of the story? Did you notice all the cool linguistics? No, whatever. The gravity. Can you explain how that works? no, sorry, I can't. You know, so, but you're gonna get those people because you can't do everything right. So, you know, don't be afraid of that, because I think that's something that stops a lot of people. Oh my God, what if I get it wrong? Well, you're gonna get something wrong.
Right.
So don't worry about it, just concentrate on the stuff you're interested in and get that right. And the people who like that will be like, oh, whatever, she doesn't do physics. I don't care about that anyway. I like this stuff and she does this really well. So, you know, I just want to throw that out, because if I had known that 15 years ago, I would have been a lot less stressed.
The catch is, I think, and it's something that you sort of hinted at, there is that class of science fiction that is the one idea, the one technology, the one physics concept, whatever, that drives the story. Tau zero and, you know, this, like, time dilation, or, you know, yeah.
A lot of the early ones.
Yeah, a lot of early sci-fi was like that. Forever War, Joe Haldeman's
Yeah,
Forever War.
exactly.
And if you get that wrong, then then you have like core problems, because then science has like moved past your story, and any sci-fi that deals with life on Mars or a view of like Venus that thought that it was capable of sustaining life.
Yeah.
We've kind of progressed beyond. But there's that class of science fiction that explores one theme and then extrapolates it. And then there's Star Trek, you know, which doesn't really. It's the future.
And actually, Forever War it is one of my favorite books, not only because, so Haldeman wrote it in like 71 or 72, and after the fact said, look, you know, I was in Vietnam. It is so clearly a story about Vietnam for him, but the you know, to not spoil it, one of the major aspects of it is time dilation, and so you have ships traveling at the speed of light, or very, very close to the speed of light, and you're basically, the outside world is changing a lot while you aren't changing, and so that, you know, as you get to your destination, you don't know what you're going to find. Are you going to find ships that have also been traveling the speed of light and are from your past? Or are you going to get there and say, oh, everybody is this, and, you know, they've all had improvements in technology, and now I'm fighting into my future.
Okay, so we got 10 minutes.
Yeah. There is a question over here.
Yeah, about your time dilation thing from Ender's War, and I mean, what if you send the ships out with instructions? Once you get to your destination, assess the situation, take no hostile action unless you absolutely have to.
Right. And that's the intelligent way to send out your killer death fleet.
There you go.
You just also need to make sure that your killer death fleet, if you're sending them out there to kill things, don't have saboteurs, don't have...
It's like the probe from Star Trek 4.
Right.
Right? They were just looking for whales.
They were just looking for whales, and they don't know that...
But they tried to communicate before they did the disastrous things, right? To just know people to talk back to them.
No, their communication was that disastrous thing.
Oh, that's true. It was been a long time.
Spoilers again, sorry.
For Star Trek 4.
I know. This is a common joke between me and my friends is, you know, I'll say like, something Rosebud, and I'll go like, oh, spoilers.
What, seriously? Oh my God.
Rosebud.
Exactly. Spoiler. So, another thing I wanted to ask is, Rob, Maggie, what is one of your favorite sci-fi works?
Oh boy. All of them.
If there is something that the audience would be like, I want to read a sci-fi book, what would be a book to send them to?
A book. So I was going to say a movie.
Oh, you or tell a movie, that's fine.
I like Close Encounters of the Third Kind a lot, because there's a mystery involved, and it's it's first contact, and I like how optimistic it is. I like the fact that like there's the government, but it's not like sinister government agents chasing people down, and I like that it's like people. I like to think that this is what it would be like.
Right.
Like scientists working together to figure out what's going on, and I love the bit. I love the bit at the end, the John Williams track when the ship lands, and it's gorgeous.
Spoilers.
Spoilers. Yeah, spoilers. So like that's it. Like I have a fursuit. My fursuit is named Kodai because I don't talk and I do that. Like I like the hand gestures from it. The Sultan Kodai hand gestures. So that I would say Close Encounters of the Third Kind is my like.
Wow. You want me to pick one? Do you know how much I read?
I know.
Oh
Well,
my
and
gosh.
that's my problem too. If you want to think about it, I can
Go
add
for it,
something.
yeah.
I would say, early this year, we lost a very special author to me. We lost Ursula K. Le Guin. There was a book called The Left Hand of Darkness. It's not very long. It's, maybe 200 pages. It is just wonderful because I'm trying to not spoil things. Basically, humanity had built a civilization. There was a fall, and you lost communication between all of the colony worlds. And somewhere on one of these colony worlds, they developed this very benevolent, humanist, ecumenical civilization. And they are going back out to the colony worlds to try and reestablish contact. Well, this has been thousands, well, I don't know how long she worked into it. Worlds have changed. And so this is an envoy who is sent on a peaceful mission to establish communications. They are the only person from the ecumenical civilization on this planet. They have no support and no technology. This is them trying to build communications with this civilization, and it is just great.
Okay, so
And it doesn't have monsters or anything.
I know, that's shocking.
I know.
Strange reading habits. No, just kidding. So I read a lot of military science fiction because I like it. But one of the biggest influences on me and on my writing was actually James White did a series called Sector General. And it's about a general hospital in space that does medicine for aliens as well as people. And they're basically like medical case mystery stories, but with aliens, which I thought was the coolest thing ever. I'm like, you take like medical mystery and put it in the future. It was like the neatest blending of two separate genres that I had read at that time. And I just loved the concept of, alien medicine case studies, with that being the problem. Well, how do I solve the medical mystery with this species that isn't getting better when it's supposed to, and it's a heavy gravity creature, and it was just really cool. So they have collected all those. They were written in the 70s. And they collected them all into omnibuses, so you can buy like 2 of them and get all of them, and they're really a lot of fun. They're written in the 70s, so you have to go into them thinking the attitudes
They're all going to
were,
be wearing bell bottoms?
well, attitudes were different, about things, but it's historical by now. You just get over it. But I really liked those. Those were great. So I guess unless we have any other questions, we're probably up against our limit.
Yeah, we got technically 5 minutes left.
Oh, okay.
But
Myself, I would suggest Shonen Alliance.
you know who the author is?
Louise Norman.
Yes, that has cats in it, doesn't it?
Yep.
Yeah.
And
was
it
gonna
also
say-
has reptiles and other aliens.
I was
There's
like-
actually a species of aliens that during their life cycle, they actually end up changing their sex. They start out male, then they go female, then they go neuter.
Yeah.
That's actually one of the other aspects of Left Hand of Darkness, is that there is transgenderism. So
Any questions? Anything else? Random comments?
Yeah, that's-
Complaints?
I'm just going to reiterate that The Hell Jumper is a story that everyone in this room should read because it hits on so many of these points that we've talked about. And it's the guy's first story, so I'm kind of impressed by it, honestly.
Okay, and so the last thing I want to do is tell everyone where they can find your fiction here at the convention.
Go to the For Planet table, Dogs of War. That's a military sci-fi anthology. I'm in the first volume of that, and then my author bio at the end tells you where I live and where you can find more of me online.
At Fur Planet, you can buy Bleak Horizons. I have a story in here. Again, my pen name is James Stone because I'm weird. If you want to get a business card, I have basically my email and my Twitter accounts. have hopefully 2 more stories coming out this year, which are weirdly not sci-fi. One is horror, and one is sort of ancient Japanese, Chinese culture swordmaster.
Cool. And I don't have work at the con, I just have work at bookstores. But I have business cards, so if you want business cards.
That implicitly makes it a place to find where to find you.
That's
and
true, but
find
not-
your works at the con.
Well, yeah. I
Right
guess
here.
That's true, you could like use your phone or something, but I guess.
Work is everywhere.
My work is
In the cloud.
in the cloud. It is. Oh, well, thank you all for
Yeah,
coming.
definitely. Thank you very much.
Thank